Thank you for being here. It's great to have this particular session, uh, Taking Stock of Election 2024, Challenges and Opportunities for Science. And this session will address pressing questions facing the research enterprise and the potential for science to improve the human condition in the coming administration. So I'd like to start by welcoming my guests here today, Ms. Dr. Jelana Sheets, Associate Director, Science and Society Program, the Aspen Institute. Carrie Funk, Senior Advisor for Public Engagement with Science and Society Program, the Aspen Institute. Alec Tyson, Associate Director of Pew Research Center. And Tobin Smith, Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Public Policy at the Association of American Universities. Okay, so I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but we recently had an election. And obviously that has implications for science, as it does for any administration. Whether there was a renewal of the Biden-Harris administration, it should be on. Whether there's a renewal of the Biden-Harris administration going forward with Dr. Harris or Ms. Harris, or whether it was the transition to the Trump administration, there will be changes. Priorities always change when an administration shifts. And so we now have some knowledge of what the next administration plans to do via their current appointments, but we're going to talk about these issues of relevance to science in the context of that background. So I'd just like to start the conversation first by asking each of the panelists if you could explain to me how you feel, what do you foresee in relations to the challenges and opportunities for science in the next administration? And can you offer a key takeaway that you hope to convey regarding the role of science in policy and society?
So I'll start with that. So as Jamie mentioned, I'm with the Aspen Institute Science and Society Program. And so we're a nonpartisan organization that aims to catalyze and connect community leaders, scientists, or current and future scientists, policymakers, and the general public. And so when I think about different challenges and opportunities, climate change is the first thing that comes to mind. Climate change and climate resilient. I also think about the ethical development and use of technologies like AI. And then I also think about public trust in science, which we can continuously hear about. And I know that we'll get into that today as well. And then just me being a behavioral scientist, a public health professor, I can't help but recognize challenges related to healthcare, and health disparities. There are a number of opportunities that could be available, and I think a lot of that stems from listening to people, listening to the community. So thinking about community engagement and ensuring that community voices are heard and at the table. And I think that there's an opportunity to foster a strong public health system. I also think that when we think about, making science-informed decisions, part of that is ensuring that there is an equitable and inclusive STEM education and STEM career pipeline. And so that's extremely important. And then I think I have one other note. I'll leave it there, but those are some of the things that I think that are challenges and opportunities. If I had to talk about a takeaway, I would say that it would be the integration of science in policy in an accessible and transformative way. And so again, listening to communities, transparency, and creating policies that benefit all people. Okay, and even just thinking about really focusing in on those on marginalized or underserved communities and making sure that the policies that exist benefit them as well.
Carrie, what challenges and opportunities do you see in the next administration?
All right, these are on. This is on right now. Okay, so you started with a really hard question. We're going to do our best to give some answers. My lens is as a social researcher. I have been a public opinion researcher of science and the implications of science for society for some time. And I think, I tend to take an even broader lens on that, where my goal is to really try to understand the forces shaping public opinion over time, whether it's through science and politics and all sorts of other areas. So I'm more of as a policy observer of this election, I mean, I think there's one thing we just want to point out, the obvious, that we've all been living in a really closely divided society for a good number of years now, and we're seeing these effects. One example that we know from the first Trump administration, according to media reports, there were over 100 environmental regulations that were changed during that administration. The Biden administration comes along, there's a bit of a ping pong in the policy world as they went to undo all of those regulations and add new policies that would help accelerate a reliance on renewable energy sources. So as we're looking into what is still a crystal ball about the second Trump term, we can all expect a lot of change. Okay, but we're going to take a breath. I think what that means for us is that we're really going to have to think about our fundamentals and what is fundamentally important to our common goals. And then I suspect we're going to have to be a lot more creative about how we get to common ground. So that's what we can say right now without truly knowing anything. There's two things I want to talk about. And one is that as I think about the science policy nexus and kind of what would make the biggest difference, I think the biggest difference for us would come from a better way to communicate the value of science and specifically scientific research. I come to that position, maybe because it's dear to my heart, but I would also point out that it was is on the short list from Marcia McNutt, the head of the National Academies, where she finishes with, none of the other steps we could take to support scientific research will matter or are even possible if we don't have public support. So we've been in this space a long time. We know that we keep trying, and I'm really sympathetic to some of the ways to do it. I suspect that there's one part of it, which is if we just talk about the ways in which science has helped in the past, then we can just say as the public, hey, what have you done for me lately? And that's a problem. But I think even more importantly, we need to be thinking about how to communicate scientific research in plain language, which essentially means not in scientific jargon. It means language that will be on an equal playing field so that we are speaking as equals and not seen as speaking down to others, not speaking in a language other people can't understand. And then beyond plain language, I think the really hard part is to figure out a way to communicate how scientific research has relevance for us, the citizens. Not for the scientists doing it, but why it should matter for everyone else. So that's, I think, a challenge we haven't fully cracked. There's lots of interesting ways to try it. We keep trying. And then the one thing I would point out in terms of a wake-up call from the election results, it has to do with the educational divide that has now solidified and widened in politics. And the reason why that should be a wake-up call is because it's also a division that we've seen in views of science for many years. And in fact, the strongest correlate of positive views of science is actually education. So in terms of what else we could be doing, I think we need a more active effort to bridge our own educational divide, to find ways to communicate the relevance of science research across all levels of education, all segments of society. That's, to Jelana's point, how do we get to a science that benefits everyone? That's the goal, and I think we're not doing enough to try to shape that.
Great. Alec, do you have any thoughts on, what's the relevance of science now, and what are the challenges of opportunities that we're facing?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. And it's already some wonderful insights shared, right? What I do in my day job is to use social science tools like surveys and secondary data analysis of government data to understand how Americans are thinking about and engaging with science-informed topics. How do people feel about climate change? How do people feel about energy policy? under this broad umbrella of health, things like vaccines, both COVID vaccines and childhood vaccines. What are people's attitudes and behaviors around those? And then increasingly thinking more about artificial intelligence and the way it has the potential to shape so many ways in which we work and live. So if you think about those science-informed issues, particularly the three I just mentioned, it's a really critical juncture for those topics, arguably an inflection point, and absolutely the election presents both challenges and opportunities for those of us who approach it from a social science perspective, and where I sit from a nonpartisan, non-advocacy role, trying to provide good information and good understanding, but absolutely from practitioners who are in these issues trying to advance outcomes, right? And I'll give you one example. It is very early, but it seems to me that we're about to have a pretty far-reaching conversation about the role of health agencies, federal health agencies in this country. That presents some challenges. In my professional role, it presents an opportunity for an organization like mine to bring good public opinion data to the table and ask Americans, what are your expectations, or what do you expect from your federal government in terms of its health services? What types of policies are you open to? What policies are you less open to? So it's, in some ways, look, administration change happens every 4 or 8 years, and it does re-energize the topics we cover in a lot of different ways. And for me, it reaffirms our core role, at least the core role at the organization where I work, is to make sure the public voice is at that table when these science issues are being debated. If I had a through line, it's been previewed already, but I would come back to trust in science or trust in scientists. We'll have an opportunity to talk more about this as this panel goes on. There are a lot of factors that shapes folks' orientations to, say, climate change or vaccines or AI, things like party ID, race and ethnicity, age and education. But this concept of trust in scientists, whether you're on the front foot and open and receptive to hearing from scientists about scientific information, or whether you have a more distrustful attitude and you're sort of on the back foot there, ways to support, further, and strengthen trust in science and scientists is a theme that I hear across conversations like these on almost a daily or weekly basis. So I'm excited to talk more about that.
Great, thank you. Toby, what are you thinking about in terms of challenges and opportunities in the near future?
So just by way of background, the AAU, the Association of American Universities that I work for, represents 69 leading research universities, publics and private in the US and 2 in Canada. So I spend my days actually walking the halls of Congress, talking to members, working with staff on both sides of the aisle, and trying to understand what's on their minds. So as we look towards challenges, the challenges have largely, some of them are already, you can tell what they are just by where Congress has been going and where we've been working with, whether it's Republicans or Democrats on both sides. I'm going to pick up on something Carrie said, and that's the communication of the impact and the value. And if you look at what just happened in this election, the reality is, I think I just heard this figure that 80% of the counties in the country voted for Donald Trump. So what's that mean? It means a lot of individuals in rural areas voted for Donald Trump. The dark blue areas, urban areas voted for Harris, and some of the fights are in the suburbs, and that's been going that way and trending that way. But what it really means, when you look at the universities I represent, we are in those 20% of those counties that voted for Harris. And it means that scientists often live in those communities, work in those communities, and there's a large group of people out there who don't know a scientist, don't live by a scientist or engineer, or if they do, they don't know it. And scientists and engineers often don't do a good job talking about what they do to their neighbors. So even if they do, they may not know. But it also means we're going to have to think about how we talk to the whole of the country, and why, when we talk about impact, people who live in the communities that our universities reside in, they get it. They see the economic impact, they see the value, they see the spin outs, they see those things. But I grew up in, I'll hold up the hand because I'm a Michigander. So I grew up in the thumb of Michigan, and I came to work for a Democratic member of Congress who was pro-life, pro-guns, and pro-labor. He won Saginaw Bay City, which was at the end of the I-75 corridor, because of the labor piece, and he won the area that I was from because of those things that tapped into people's values and what they cared about. And the issue is, how do we make people care about science? That is a challenge in a world where if you read it on the internet, it must be true, right? And in a world of alternative facts. And I think, so the number one challenge, as I look at how do we keep investment in agencies like NSF up? How do we keep trust in NIH up? How do we deal with things, concerns about research security and protecting the research that we do at our universities? And how do I argue for the value of international partnerships? Part of it is getting to that group of people and explaining why that matters to them. And so the one thing I would say that, and we've probably talked about this more, is it's more important for scientists and engineers to be active in policy than ever before. And it's a time when it's easy to say, I don't like the results of the election. I'm just going to go back and work in my lab and, kind of hide. But this is a time where, and I'll conclude with a quote from Einstein, who said, those who have the privilege to know have a duty to act. And I think this is a time when we need to act.
So, Jelana, you work at the Aspen Institute Science and Society program, and we're talking about the needs of science. So why are we talking about the needs of science, but how does the Aspen Institute balance these two issues?
All right. So just as our name kind of says, we work at issues at the intersection of science and society. And so the program was founded almost 5 years ago. And our work is situated in 4 different pillars. It's global science, public trust in science, science and social justice, and science policy. So although we have a pillar focused specifically on science policy, policy is inherently a part of each of the pillars. And, as has been shared today, we live in a polarized society. And so one of the things that we've done previously was that we had a magazine called The Future of America, and it was the election issue. And this is where we first started kind of looking at issues in society related to science that at least voters should care about. Okay, and this was the first magazine that I believe that we had done in this space. And so we partnered with Nautilus Magazine, and we're funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, as well as the Rita Allen Foundation, to produce a digital magazine called Science at the Ballot Box. And so the purpose of Science at the Ballot Box was to really illuminate the fact that science is not just a tool for innovation, and it's really the foundation for informed decisions and decisions that voters and the voters should care about. And so the topics in the magazine range from AI and public trust and polling to community engagement to AI, right? And climate change. So these pressing issues that that voters should care about and that should know about. And one of the things that has been said today, I think by each of my co-panelists, is communication. And so oftentimes these topics are communicated in ways that don't really resonate with the public, or that the public doesn't understand. And so we wanted to produce a publication that others could understand, that they could relate to, and so forth. And so when it comes to thinking about how we balance all these different pillars or domains, it's really thinking about what the needs of society are, what are the pressing issues, and then communicating about them in ways that are relatable. And I think that that's what we've done through Science at the Ballot Box. And I think I'll end it there.
Well, that's great. And really getting this issue of trust in science on the table is a really important one. And thinking, a lot of folks in the scientific community really considered the pandemic as an event that put science in the hearts and minds of the public. Alec, what does your data tell us about the response to the pandemic in terms of the public's trust in science? Are we in a crisis of trust in science, and how do we deal with audiences who are sort of ambivalent about science and society?
So let's think about the pandemic for a minute. Science was absolutely in the spotlight, and developing a vaccine to a novel disease in record time and making it available to millions of Americans was an incredible achievement, right? At the same time, what happened also during the pandemic was there was some confusion around the messaging from the public's perspective. Eventually, that evolved into some disagreement over policy, scientific discovery identifying COVID-19 in a highly transmissible airborne disease. A separate question is a policy question. To what extent should we close things like schools and for how long? Those were questions that were very divisive, often along political lines. And so at the end of the day, we came out of the pandemic and we actually saw a decline in overall levels of trust or confidence in scientists. About 87% or so had either the question we ask, either a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in scientists to act in the best interest before the pandemic or in the pandemic's first year. That fell about 14 points by last October to about 73%. Now, it's worth saying that's a pretty high rating overall. We live in an era of low trust in institutions, high polarization. So in that sense, scientists still enjoyed high relative standing, but it's not where they were before the pandemic, right? And we put out a report this week, just Thursday, and we showed a modest but significant 3-point uptick in trust or confidence in scientists. So it's the first increase in trust we've seen since the pandemic. The survey also explored some other dimensions, several of which have been mentioned previously, but I'll walk through a few of them, is if the aim of the community is to get back to that level of confidence or trust that scientists enjoyed before the pandemic, where are some places to look? Where are some places to start? I think communication has been already emphasized quite forcefully, but a statistic that y'all might find useful: only 45% of Americans view scientists as good communicators. That's 9 points lower than in 2019 and one of the lowest ranking positive characteristics out of the 10 that we ask about. Another trait that we asked about out of this list of 10, and you could say, do these describe scientists well or not so well, was an item that said, feel superior to others. And that's one to reflect on, right? It suggests to me, or the data suggests to me, that there's room to grow for scientists in seeing more connected or relatable to the everyday issues that people face in their own life. That could be another potential domain that could help support trust. And then this whole event is framed in the context of the election, so I think it's probably appropriate to bring up partisan affiliation explicitly, right? That trust or confidence in scientists is higher, about 88% among Democrats and folks who lean to the Democratic Party. It's 20 or so points lower among Republicans and people who lean to the Republican Party, about 66%. Now, again, context is important here. 66% is still a majority of all Republicans who say, yeah, I've got a pretty confident relationship with scientists, but there is a gap there. And if you want to think about getting back to the levels of trust or confidence we saw before the pandemic, part of that equation is thinking about how to strengthen, restore, or hold on to trust among conservatives.
Great, thank you. Carrie, this is an area you've spent quite a few years working in. Do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I think Alec and I used to work together, so we tend to agree about the data. But you know, the first thing I think we agree on is that there's no need to panic about these trust ratings. And so there's a lot of people who point that out, that on the whole, there's still kind of a net positive evaluation of people's confidence in scientists to act in the best interests of the public. But what I say is, okay, don't panic. That doesn't mean you do nothing. And so there is not just a lot of room to grow. What has happened over time is the size of the community that has more of a negative view of scientists, and particularly among Republicans, but just also overall, that's grown. And so you can now expect going forward, just expect skepticism, expect questioning. And the question for everyone in the scientific community is, how can I hear that and respond in a way that respects other people and with openness to hearing what they have to say? Because in order to bring them along, in order to build a relationship that will help foster trust going forward, you have to listen with openness, and you have to share your reasoning, why you believe what you do, what is the evidence, and do it in a way that that essentially brings people together as opposed to kind of lecturing to them. And that's really hard to put into practice, but that's the goal.
Great. And you raised the issue of openness, and I extend that to sort of the international front. We are here at Sigma Xi's International Forum on Research Excellence, but we're also in the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. And so this is the heart of federal science policy. Toby, can you talk a little bit about what the current environment represents in terms of the importance of science policy in addressing some of these issues? Going forward, why it's important for the U.S. to be a global leader, and any changes that are happening may affect that. But there's also internal challenges. How do we balance issues of national security versus global cooperation and openness?
So earlier, the question was about the importance of science in light of the election. The reality, election or no election, the problems in the international, the global challenges, the societal challenges we face, they involve, and the solutions will, if we want to seek the right solutions, will be based on facts and evidence and science. So science is more important when we look at whether it's climate change, whether we look at how to address global pandemics. One of the challenges, though, is we face an increasing sense of nationalism. I'm concerned that, we talk about, protectionism, but I'm concerned about scientific protectionism, the notion that, and I think there are some policymakers as I go up to the Hill who still think we have the lead in many areas of science. So they want to, during the Cold War, there were concerted efforts by the Soviet Union to steal technology, to even infiltrate universities. We now hear that from members about China, and that Chinese students are taking information back. The concern I have is there are certain issues, and we saw this with the pandemic. Had we not had information about the genome for COVID-19, we couldn't have gotten to where we got so quickly. And that was shared with us by Chinese partners. I worry that there is this thinking that we can wall off science and that will be helpful to us. And what's different about now in the Cold War is we did have, we were the leaders in key areas of fundamental science and technology during the Cold War compared to the Soviet Union. Now there are many areas, artificial intelligence being one of them, where China's ahead of us. So we have to be careful. Doesn't mean there's not a need to make sure we are protecting and securing information and protecting the integrity of the research, particularly fundamental research we do at universities. But we also have to be careful not to go too far, as has been said, is related to the notion that you can wall off certain technologies and you do yourself good. Is that for the advancement of science, you need windows and walls, windows as well as walls. And we need to know what's going on in other countries and need to continue to collaborate.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you raised the issue of artificial intelligence, which is obviously a global competitive research space. And there's also issues there related to inequities and biases in the system. So Jelana, how can we address the issues of potential biases and imbalances on the artificial intelligence front?
Okay. Well, when we think about AI, one of the things that we can do is ensure that that we train the data that we use to train it is representative of diverse populations. I think that's really important. And then also kind of building on diversity, and diversity goes beyond just like race and ethnicity. It's thinking about the teams that are developing these systems. And so diversity in terms of educational background. In some of the interviews that I did for the article in Science at the Ballot Box, what AI can do for your country, those that I interviewed really spoke to the need for social scientists being in the room and really being able to connect, the social impacts, or even kind of think about the unintended consequences of AI that maybe somebody without that knowledge or that educational background would have an understanding of. Also ensuring that, diverse gender identities, Again, race, and ethnicity do play a role. And so, and even just thinking about cultural background. So making sure that those at the table are diverse. And then also thinking about engaging local communities in the design and the deployment of AI. And this will require a significant amount of transparency. And so I think that, in order to have more equitable and ethical AI, then these are some of the things that we need to think about. But it's also a conversation that needs to be continued because the technology is advancing at a rapid rate. And people, I feel, some people know just enough to be dangerous in terms of like how to use the technology. And so I think also there's this element of the need to monitor or even monitor or audit the development of AI as well to just ensure that it's not biased. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done, and this is like the type of question that I think the responses will evolve over time as more AI systems are developed and utilized.
It's really important. I think it's been a shortfall of science in many technology development processes where we have not taken up these issues of inequities early in the development stages. But just in general, thinking about the public, Alec, how does the public feel about AI? Do they understand it? Do they have limits to which they would prefer scientists to operate in the space? What are you learning?
Yeah, it's a great question. On the one hand, really large shares of Americans are aware of artificial intelligence, upwards of 90% or more. But the share of Americans who have a rich, detailed understanding of it, who can recognize it in all instances of their life, remains pretty modest, more like 3 in 10, right? So lots of folks have heard of it. Fewer really understand how it's interacting in their life. One of the predominant themes we've seen in our work, much of it that Carrie and I had done together, is this theme of caution, right? And one question that I think encapsulates that, 52% of Americans say they're more concerned than excited about the increased use of artificial intelligence in daily life. Only 10% say they're more excited than concerned, and the remainder of the public falls kind of in between. They feel a mix of these two views, but that's a clear signal of caution, right? And there is openness to regulation. That's something we can look for in the next 4 years, to what extent the federal government in this country does or does not take a more active role trying to regulate artificial intelligence. Certainly a conversation in Europe, but there's going to be a growing need for these conversations as the scope and abilities of artificial intelligence continue to evolve. One point that I find really interesting, and you see it in our conversations with US adults in focus groups or in surveys, is this idea of what it means to essentially be human. There is an element of promise to AI. There's also peril and concern, but there is an element of promise. If what you get clearly from looking at all of the public opinion data we collect is if artificial intelligence can be used to handle mundane tasks, to make us more efficient, to ease burden, well, that actually presents some really interesting opportunities. Can we invest more in things that humans are good at, in emotional intelligence, creativity, being saved in our own jobs from things we really don't like to do and are mechanized and routinized, right? And so, look, there's a lot to be concerned about in the artificial intelligence space, but I think there are areas of promise, and the clear signal we get from the public is protect what it means to be human. And one more example in the context of medicine, people really don't want artificial intelligence coming in the way of their patient-provider relationship, the relationship with your doctor. They are very open to artificial intelligence to scan an image for potential signs of skin cancer. So the specifics really matter here, and I think fit for purpose is a big theme here when you think about artificial intelligence.
Great. And, you're just laying out some challenges that need to be addressed, and those are largely going to be dealt with through policy. Where do we draw lines and barriers? And so, Toby, can you talk a little bit about what the opportunities in science policy are? You've touched on the importance of scientists being engaged, but what are the opportunities in science policy? Where do you see scientists being most effective at applying themselves? And do you have advice on where they can get trained and what they need to be trained on to be effective in those spaces?
Yeah, I think a starting point is to figure out how to make science accessible to the non-scientists. And I often talk about my career because I wasn't a scientist. I came to do science policy as a non-scientist. And I often talk about my career being one of cross-cultural communications. So it's learning to talk, and for graduate students, I always say, figure out how to make your science accessible. And even if your particular research project isn't understandable and you can't explain that, explain something that's happened in your discipline that nobody would have ever predicted would have an impact on somebody's life, and explain how that happened. Because I don't think it's well understood. And I'm worried, honestly, about some of the attacks, the Proxmire type attacks, which are coming back. There's going to be a reexamination of, are we, every new administration, there's usually an examination of, are we spending the money that we're spending on all sorts of things? Is it well invested? And I am absolutely sure, because of the lack of understanding of how basic science works, there will be questions about scientific grant titles. We're wasting people's money. And so that's the first thing. But also figure out how to get involved just in it could be just outreach in a community. It could be outreach to schools. It could be getting involved in a local commission where, frankly, having a scientist on that commission or on a school board is valuable. It doesn't have to be a federal level engagement, but there are other opportunities at the state level. There are opportunities to certainly talk to members of Congress and let them know that you care. And we need that, as we potentially will face questions about investments in these key agencies. So getting people to talk up and being active is really important. So there's lots of opportunities. In terms of the training, I'm pleased to say slowly, but surely there are more programs in scientific communications. There are programs in policy. AAAS runs their Catalyzing Advocacy in Science and Engineering program, and they've done the AAAS Fellowship program, but there's now graduate student clubs in science policy. So there's more and more opportunities, and we just need to keep building that and stressing that part of being a good scientist is the ability not only to do the science in your lab, but to communicate it to others and to express that importance to policymakers.
Yeah, great. You're setting up an interesting discussion, because there are more and more programs cropping up to help scientists get involved in policy. Even Sigma Xi has a science policy boot camp that we offer every year. We're training fellows at the state level in North Carolina. But Jelana, you've been a civic science fellow, and you have some unique experiences there. Can you give us some feedback about what that experience was like and what the other opportunities are?
Sure, I will. And I'll also just kind of like piggyback on some of the things that Tobin said briefly. And so I think that like training is extremely important. When I was working on my doctorate in health behavior, I did a minor in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at my university. And so when I decided to make that a minor, I guess my advisor had lots of questions, because at that time, no one had gone outside of the school to have a minor in public affairs. And so for me, in the work that I do around, just really when you think about public health in general, so even beyond like my focus on physical activity and eating behaviors and the built environment, in public health, policy is extremely important. And science underpins public policy. So for me, in order to really make decisions that trickle down to community in the individual level, it was important for me to have an understanding of policy. And so I just wanted to kind of make that, make that note. But as Jamie said, I was a civic science fellow, and this is an amazing program that aims to strengthen connections between science and the public. And so they have cohorts of fellows every year or two that work with the host organization that's working to address challenges around or challenges at the intersection of science and society. And so I was a civic science fellow at the Aspen Institute. And so host organizations are provided grants to hire fellows. And so what was really unique about this experience in general is that as fellows, we come from all different backgrounds. And so there were scientists and there were non-scientists, and they're training you to communicate about science, but then also really value the lived experience and working with communities and learn about community engagement and how to engage the public in science. And we keep talking about like communication, and that's extremely important. So how do we communicate to different types of audiences, from community members, but then also policymakers, or just or other researchers? And so the civic science program, when I think about those who were in my cohort and those who are in the current cohort, we bring these multidisciplinary insights to solving complex problems. And so just kind of building off something I said earlier, when you think about like who's at the table, if you don't have a mix of people at the table, they're going to be blind spots. And so when you build multidisciplinary teams to kind of address or solve an issue, then the solution might be better. The solution might work more. The solution will likely work more so than it would without those voices at the table. And so I definitely encourage emerging leaders or people that are working at the intersection of science and social justice to look into the Civic Science Fellows Program.
Excellent. And a lot of these fellows I've observed work on issues related to climate change and energy and environment, and a lot of the challenges that we see in very staunchly divided parts of the public. So, Carrie, you look at this data. Is there a hope? Are there opportunities in the climate space for us to really bring people together on these highly political issues?
Yes, I promised that we could say something about this. So yes, there's a political divide on kind of every issue related to climate, energy, and the environment. Correct. But that there is also some areas of common ground. I'm going to start with the common ground. And in fact, we had heard candidate Trump talking recently about clean air and clean water, and that's one of them. We do have core values. We do all want things like clean air, clean water, quality healthcare, access to healthcare, access to good education. These are all kind of common ground things. And it is a little naive of me to bring this up, but that's the fundamentals that we have to get to, because we know that politically the two parties want to come at how government works in such different ways that we have to that's what I mean by we got to go back to fundamentals. What do we really want? And then we need to think creatively about how do we get to common ground on something like clean air and clean water. And the reason I can, I'll do one factoid, which is one of the reasons why we have confidence that there is some kind of core values there that people can agree on, is a study that Alec and I did with qualitative interviews of people who, what do we call them? Didn't see urgency in acting on climate change. That's what we called it. But it was really, of course, always fascinating to hear how they talk. And at the end of the day, they are talking about those core values. They want a clean environment, but they don't see a need for government overreach to get there. And so we just have to keep that in mind, I think, and look for different ways to get to the solution.
I want to go back to Jelana, because I think you've done some writing on the concept of bringing folks together and maybe forward thinking. And so what would you have to say about what Carrie was just pointing?
No, I think that she's right on or spot on. And I think that like part of it is thinking about like who the messenger is when you're working with communities. And oftentimes that has to be like a trusted source, someone you can't just, go into a community and expect people to respond. There has to be some type of relationship that is built over time. So, just as much as you want them to trust you. I mean, it's kind of like it's a two-way street. And, one of the things that Carrie and I wrote in our article was that, just the importance of, or really acknowledging that building trust takes time. And so I think that for some sectors that doesn't really resonate, and that, you know, sometimes you have to have a little humility when you go into working with communities, and you may not be able to operate by your rules. You'll need to operate by the rules of the community or develop rules together to kind of engage with one another. So I think that that's really important. And so I did want to touch a little bit more on some of the work that the Civic Science Fellows are doing, because I think that they're doing a great job of bringing communities together. So Andrea Lopez was one of the fellows in my cohort, and she worked for CNC of Puerto Rico. And so her work focused on developing culturally relevant strategies to get people throughout Puerto Rico to test for COVID. And so the strategies that they developed were actually adopted by the Puerto Rican House of Representatives. And so when you see that work and that the value that it can bring to an entire society, and so in thinking about the outcomes of that, you know, Puerto Rico had one of the highest COVID testing rates in 2021. And so, you know, just again, bringing home the importance of working with communities in developing solutions. There's a civic science fellow in the current cohort, Dr. Michael Akinwumi, and he's looking at state level efforts to ensure that AI is safe and equitable. And so when you know, where you're putting civic science fellows or people that have other you know, types of fellowships, even like, what is it called? Those who are in like Tech Congress. You know, this is enabling the people with expertise that may not currently be in, you know, in the government or even, you know, within an organization, whether it's like a nonprofit. And so it's ensuring that you're really meeting the needs of the community, and adding that expertise is not there. One of the things that, you know, was kind of echoed throughout the Science in the Ballot Box is the importance of investments to hire people to be in these types of roles, like across sectors. And so while it's great to have, you know, these temporary placements to kind of get things moving, there does need to be, you know, some sense of permanency as well. And so I think that there's a lot of room for civic science, and especially when we think about state level and local level policymaking.
Great. And as these civic science fellows are brought into the program and they start to do more and more work, they're going to be engaging in these areas where there is a political divide. But you know, we need to draw from the data, I think. And Alec, you've got a lot of data. What does it say about the opportunity? Is there opportunity for us to bring people together around climate change?
Yeah, no, we do have a lot of data, that's for sure. A few things that help crystallize at least the partisan divide on climate change for me. Climate change, when you ask folks what issues are important to your vote, dead last for Trump voters. This election, you know, the previous elections. For Harris or Biden voters, it's very important. It's not the top issue, and that's an important piece of context here. It's not the top issue for Democrats. It's among a top tier of issues. So if you looked at just that data, you would conclude that we are just fundamentally divided. What can we do here? But that's only really a piece of this story, right? When you look at policy or different approaches to climate change, things like offering tax credits for businesses that develop carbon capture, or sealing methane links, or even widespread tree plantings, which came out of GOP congressional circles and others, what you see is that a lot of these ideas appeal to large swaths of Americans. So there's something about the framing or the salience of the issue, which is very, very different than steps that you can take to address the issue. And I would echo some of the framing that we've heard earlier. Even the language, of course, matters, but here's a specific example. Climate crisis, climate emergency, that resonates very strongly with people who have a more democratic or progressive view. It can really put people on the back foot if they have a more conservative political view. And those folks can be folks who are interested in some solutions that may also help with clean air, that also reduces planet warming carbon, right? There's a way in which there are multiple entry points for folks who are interested in solutions that would both help the environment and also reduce some of the climate warming carbon and other emissions we put in the atmosphere. So, and the last thing I'll say there is we are, as everyone knows, a two major party country. parties are incredibly complex and diverse constituencies, right? And why that matters is there are pockets within any party who express a great openness or at least different views on an issue. It could be any issue. It could be climate, it could be health, it could be vaccines, but it could also be climate. One example here is that young Republicans show much more urgency around climate than older Republicans. So thinking about coalitions not as these uniform blocks that of homogenous folks, but folks who are very different and diverse, and there are multiple entry points even within a political party to find folks who are interested in a particular issue that may be of interest to this community or others.
Great. While you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that Toby is at AAU, and you obviously have a lot of stakeholders, all the universities that are a part of your organization. So what is the role of the universities in all of this? Can they facilitate or host civic science fellows or train them? What is the role of the universities?
So certainly training scientists in the communications and on areas like policy and civics, more broadly, training all of our students in those areas. And civic discourse and dialogue is something that our presidents have been talking a lot about, and how to, promote those discussions in a respectful way that doesn't, I think some of the polarization and the politics, I think, that we've seen, it's one of the challenges we face just even in Congress these days. Historically, even while there were ideological differences, there were people like Orrin Hatch and Teddy Kennedy. They didn't agree ideologically, but they respected each other enough to come to agreements and get things done. And right now we're having trouble doing it. So I think that civic dialogue is something, but for scientists, I think it is our responsibility to think about how we train graduate students more broadly, and how we provide them with training. And like I said, there are more and more programs. The challenge is fitting that into a degree program that doesn't necessarily say that's important, and changing the culture of our faculty who were trained one way and never taught those things. And that's a tough one, but more and more, and I think showing getting younger faculty, giving them opportunities, and providing the air cover, the university leadership, saying these things are important and transferring that down to department chairs, to deans, is going to be really important to make this happen.
Jolanda, you have some
Yeah,
thoughts?
I do. And I just want to highlight the fact that Research America has done a lot of work to kind of shift the conversation and really advocate for training of students around public engagement with science. And so they recently had a microgrant program where they would fund graduate students, early career professors on public engagement in science. And they also came out with, or they had a working group that I was a part of, where we came out with a report, really a call to action for universities with recommendations on how to, incorporate public engagement with science training for students, but then also thinking about guidelines around promotion and tenure for faculty so they get credit for these types of things. So there's a lot of things that need to happen and take place more systemically to ensure that scientists are equipped with the tools and information to communicate effectively with the public.
Great. We can't have these incredible guests without having an opportunity for you to ask a question. Does anyone have a question from the audience? Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll go here because I saw your hand go up first.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this panel. I'm Kaylee Bynes from the DC Sigma Xi chapter. I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the context around good faith conversations. I think there's been some focus in this panel about, we all agree on clean air, clean water. I work in environmental public health, and I can tell you that's not true, at least in my experience. And so how do you know when you're trying to have these conversations, particularly as a scientist, that people are coming to the table in good faith, and how do you try to ensure that in prepping for these conversations?
I'll start. First of all, there will be some actors who aren't coming in good faith, and you need to know who they are, and that's by looking at their records. But also the other thing I didn't say earlier, but I think it's really, I said to act, but one challenge that scientists have too is they tend to speak before they listen. And so much, and this gets to the climate change issue, and I was thinking listening to where people are coming from. So this is a little bit different than policymakers because they oftentimes you know where they're at, you know what their view is, but even with them, you've got to listen and try and build whatever trust or commonality you can before you sit at the table with them to have a meaningful conversation. But I think in other areas like rural areas or, when we think about climate change, just for example, the reason a farmer in rural Iowa cares about climate change is going to be very different than the reason a person who owns a summer home on the Florida coast cares about climate change. And you need to figure out how to address them. And it can't just be, oh my gosh, don't you realize, that the polar bears are losing their habitats, and this is such an awful thing. So understanding where people are coming from and then shaping your message. So that I don't know. The last thing is I often get asked, what about a member or somebody who has a strong view? There are some who just you aren't, but you've got to find the people who you can talk to and have a reasonable dialogue and who are somewhat, they may not be totally in a line, but and start with trying to build that common ground with those who do. And you have to be careful because we just generalize about policymakers all the time, Republicans, Democrats. No, there are, you met one, everybody has their own perspectives and trying to tap in and understand where somebody is. It's one of the big things I say when you go into congressional meetings. Ask some questions, figure out what their view is, and then start there. Don't just walk in and say, here's my script. I've already prepared my remarks and I know what I'm going to say. Be ready to adapt and change depending on what you hear and the level of understanding of the issues already, because that in of itself, one of the biggest problems you have is sometimes scientists going in and they're talking above the member's head and they're seen as arrogant, egotistic. One reason I love to take students in is if they talk above the member's head, they're like smart and they're the future. So, but this is a challenge.
I can add a little bit. So I totally agree with everything that Tobin said. And I just want to stress that it's really important to, to do your due diligence and do the research around knowing the priorities, what's driving people to be there, that, as part of the conversation, because it will help you get a sense of where your entry point. So, when we think about, I'm just thinking about like advocacy, everyone's not meant to march in the streets, maybe someone else could be doing some other type of task, all working towards, the same thing, but there's a different approach that you would use for that person relative to someone else. So it really is about meeting people where they are and having that understanding.
Martha?
I want to thank you all for trying to be so positive. I think we all appreciate that. I would like to ask you to flip things around just a little bit and say, a lot of us have been doing a lot of the things that you're talking about, and yet we end up in a not entirely positive situation. I wonder if you could be Monday morning quarterbacks and look back 10 to 15 years and say, what did we do that got us to this situation so that we can change our behavior going to the future?
Do you have any data on that?
Well, this is a really hard one for me, but I'll do my best here. I'm not a scientist. I don't identify as a scientist. I study public opinion data and trends and kind of national attitudes. And I don't want this to sound Pollyannish because I know how it can, but I was at a session yesterday about resilience or preparedness for future pandemics, right? And the metaphor I would use here is there will be other highly polarized flashpoints in science or scientific informed policy that really divide Republicans and Democrats. That's a near certainty. So what the data would suggest to me to ask to the community, because again, I don't identify as a scientist, is what's being proactively done to build robust networks that cross party lines. And I don't want that to sound too general, but I think the signs we've gotten in the past 20 years, it's not just the past 4 years, the past 12 years, growing polarization, growing distrust, growing antipathy from the other side. I think there could be a more focused conversation about engagement conversations that explicitly center politics as opposed to other characteristics that are equally important, but maybe the field is more comfortable talking about than saying, what are we doing to build robust networks now that reach across partisan lines? So when the next flare up of a scientific issue does happen, again, I'll draw from that session yesterday is, are you regularly talking with someone who very strongly disagrees with you on politics, but you have some alignment on the science issues to talk about? Those networks are so valuable in a moment of crisis where you can call someone who trusts you and look at where you have something in common to go from, you know?
Great, thank you. So we're coming to the close of this. I would just like to ask, we've got folks coming in for the next session already. I'd like to ask each panelist to give us one takeaway that we can apply during the next administration in terms of the importance of science and science policy. Ilana?
And we talked about being neutral earlier. I think that one takeaway is to be optimistic. I mean, regardless of, your position on this, and we've talked about being in a polarized society, the issues that we are talking about are going to persist over time. And so they're not going to go away tomorrow. And so I think that it's just really important to, as Tobin has said, if you have the knowledge, it's basically your duty to act. And so I think that we just have to stay committed to whatever your charge is. And I've said it 100 times, listen to the voices of the people, engage them in conversations and in the design of solutions, policy solutions, whatever it may be. And so I just encourage optimism and action.
Great, Carrie?
Okay, okay. This is difficult. But I just don't see any benefit from vilifying the other side, if there is another side in your point of view. And you just have to keep reaching for how to talk to each other and how to find that common ground. It doesn't help if your ultimate cause is to support scientific research and the place of scientific evidence in society, kind of turning more people away from that is not going to help that cause. So that's why I think it's important to keep listening or to start listening, whatever it takes. In terms, Toby kind of said, hey, we all need to stand up. From a census occupation standpoint, the number of scientists is not that many. So everyone needs to stand up and we need multipliers. This is why actually you need to stand up, 10 times higher, because it's a relatively small group of people compared to other occupations. So we need these other allies across occupations, across sectors, across, whatever other line you want to talk about. So we need that all in our daily life. And then I would also say, one of the things we're doing at Aspen Institute is to try to take the principles that would help build trust in direct personal relationships and try to implement that through forms like film and video that will help reach more people. So those are the kind of amplifiers that we also think might help the cause.
Great, thank you. Alec?
Well, people like things that have clear benefit in their own life, right? It's such a simple thing to say, but it's a really powerful thing. And it's part of the reason why I think 75% of Americans or 3/4 of Americans really do have a positive view of scientists. So I would just continue to lean into the fundamentals, make the case for how what's being done at your enterprise or by you personally as a scientist is helping people navigate their own lives and make their own lives more convenient, fulfilling, enriching, and amplifiers. I really like that theme, Carrie, because you do need amplifiers. Not every scientist needs to be a good communicator, but if a scientist can link with someone who is a good communicator or has a network, it can make the case for what science is doing for the people in your own community and your own network. That can be a very powerful thing.
So I just say here that I, having interacted with a lot of policymakers, a lot of members of Congress, I truly believe they all believe in science. There's very few people who say they don't. It's then what they think the science says, what they believe, and that sometimes gets tied to ideological beliefs first. And that's the challenge the scientific community has, and it's one of the reasons we need scientists very active in trying to convey that in a way that people will understand it, that again connects to where they are already coming from, not just where we think they should be coming from. And that's going to be the challenge that's before us in this new environment, which every time we have a new Congress or a new presidency, we end up with a lot of people who don't understand how science works, the process, and then what the views are. And that's the real challenge before everybody.
Great. It sounds like, well, what I'm hearing is that it's really about fulfilling e pluribus unum, and we have to do as scientists what we can to fulfill that. So thank you. Thank the panelists. And we will be starting the next program, the next session momentarily. Thank you.